4 minutes. That is how long it took. From the moment the torpedo struck to the moment the sea closed over her, just 4 minutes passed. In those 4 minutes, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people died. She was a hospital ship. Her sides were painted with enormous red crosses. She was carrying the wounded, and the doctors who tended them, and the families of a besieged city, mothers, children, the old. And she went down off the coast of Crimea on a gray November morning, so fast that the water was still boiling when the survivors surfaced. There were 8 of them. You know the Titanic, 1,500 dead, a story told and retold for over a century. You know the Lusitania, 1,100 dead, the sinking that helped pull a nation into war. Add them together. Both disasters, every soul lost on both ships. You reach about 2,700. The hospital ship Armenia killed nearly twice that. In one morning, in 4 minutes. And almost no one outside the former Soviet Union has ever heard her name. This is the story of the deadliest shipwreck you were never taught, and of the questions about her final hours that remain sealed in classified archives to this day. Before the war, the Armenia was a point of pride. Built in 1928 in the shipyards of Leningrad, she was one of the very first passenger liners constructed by the young Soviet Union. A motor ship, sleek for her day, 360 feet of steel, built to glide along the warm Crimean coast. She ran the holiday route, Odessa, Yalta, Sevastopol, carrying tourists to the sanatoriums of the Black Sea, mail in her hold, music on her decks. Her shallow draft let her slip into the small resort harbors that bigger ships could never reach. For 13 years, she was a ship of peace. Then, on the 22nd of June, 1941, the German army crossed the Soviet frontier. Within weeks, the Armenia was no longer a holiday liner. The Navy requisitioned her, stripped out the comfort, and bolted red crosses to her hull. She became a hospital ship, and a transport, and a lifeline. By late October, disaster had reached the Crimea itself. The German 11th Army, under one of Hitler's most capable generals, Erich von Manstein, had stormed the peninsula and thrown a siege around the great naval fortress of Sevastopol. The city was surrounded on land. The only door left open was the water. Here was the cruel arithmetic of the Black Sea in 1941. The Germans had almost no warships here. The sea itself belonged to the Soviets, but the sky did not. In these early months, the Luftwaffe owned the air completely, and they did not spare the Red Cross. That summer, German bombers had already sunk marked Soviet hospital ships: the Kotovsky, the Anton Chekhov, the Adzoria, the Kuban. The painted crosses had not saved a single one, so the rule was simple and merciless. Sail by night, and you might live. Sail by day, alone or poorly escorted, and you were a target waiting to be hit. Over 100 Soviet merchant ships would be sent to the bottom of this sea. By the following summer, 70% of the entire mobilized civilian fleet would be gone. The Armenia was about to sail by day. The night of the 6th of November, 1941, Sevastopol, the Armenia came alongside, and the city poured into her. There was no ticketing, no passenger list. No one stood at the gangway writing down names. In the dark, under the threat of a city about to fall, people simply climbed aboard and kept climbing. Entire hospital staffs, wounded soldiers carried on stretchers and laid in rows, doctors and nurses, civilian officials and their wives and their children, the desperate and the connected alike, all crowding onto the decks of a ship built to carry, in comfort, a few hundred. How many came aboard that night? No one will ever know. The estimates begin at 5,000. Some run as high as 10. And because no list was ever made, every one of those souls would, in a few hours, become a number without a name. She left Sevastopol around 10 that night. Her destination, the port of Tuapse, 400 kilometers down the coast, and safety. But she did not run straight for it. A short voyage east brought her not to open sea, but to the resort town of Yalta. And here the record opens its first unexplained gap. A passage that should have taken a couple of hours took 6. The Armenia did not reach Yalta until the small hours of the morning, 2:15, 2:40. Where was she in those missing hours of darkness? That question is the seed of everything that would later be whispered about her. We will come back to it. At Yalta, the scene was worse. The Germans were already in the hills above the town. From the village of Nikita, machine gun fire raked down toward the harbor. Soviet units were in retreat through the streets. The drivers bringing wounded down to the docks abandoned their trucks and ran. And still, more people were loaded onto the Armenia. More wounded, more civilians, crammed into a ship that was already past full. Again, with no one writing down a single name. Captain Vladimir Plashevsky stood on his bridge and watched the darkness thin toward dawn. He was a seaman. He knew exactly what daylight meant out on that water. He wanted to be gone, now while the night still hid them. But he was ordered to wait for the escort. The escort, when it came, was almost an insult to the danger. 2 small armed boats, 2 fighter planes overhead. For a ship carrying thousands of helpless people in a sky the enemy owned, it was a thread of protection where she needed a wall. At around 7, perhaps 8 in the morning, fully into the daylight that Plashevsky had dreaded, the Armenia cast off from Yalta and turned her bow toward the open sea. Above the masthead, the 2 fighters circled. Somewhere out there, the Tuapse coast and safety waited, hours away. She would not get a quarter of the distance. Somewhere over that gray water, a single German aircraft found them, a Heinkel. He-111, a twin-engine bomber rigged to carry torpedoes from a specialist anti-shipping unit. 1 plane, 1 pilot's decision. He saw a large ship, low and slow and heavy in the water, and he lined up his run. Whether he saw the red crosses, we cannot know. On this front, in this war, it would likely not have changed a thing. He came in low over the waves and released 2 torpedoes into the sea. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Tap the like button and subscribe. We unbury history every week. Now, back to our story. 11:25 in the morning, roughly 40 kilometers out from Yalta. The first torpedo missed. The second did not. It struck the Armenia and tore her open. A ship of nearly 5,000 tons, packed stem to stern with human beings, was broken in a single blow. Her back snapped. The 2 halves of her began at once to fold down into the sea, and then came the speed of it, the terrible, merciful, unsurvivable speed. The Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, 2 hours and 40 minutes in which to launch boats, to send signals, to say goodbye. The Armenia had 4 minutes. 4 minutes for thousands of people. The wounded who could not walk, the children, the old, the men and women trapped below decks in the dark. To understand what was happening before the sea took them, there was no time to lower the boats, barely time to reach the rail. The water that day was cold. The wind was strong, the waves high. Even for those who reached the surface, the sea offered no mercy. Around 300 people were seen in the water as she went down. By the time help reached the spot, there were 8 survivors, out of thousands. One archival transcript is even starker. It records that 6 were pulled from the water, while up to 300 had been struggling in the waves. Of the captain, Vladimir Plashevsky, there was no sign. He went down with the ship he had been ordered to sail into the daylight. And then the sea was simply empty, the way it had been for 10,000 years, as if nothing had happened there at all. A disaster of this size should have shaken a nation. It did not, because the nation was never told. In the autumn of 1941, the Soviet Union was fighting for its life on a 1,000-mile front. There were too many catastrophes to mourn. The loss of the Armenia was folded into the silence of a country that could not afford to grieve out loud. Then the Germans occupied the Crimea for nearly 3 years. By the time the war ended and the dust settled, the country was in ruins, the witnesses scattered or dead, and no one came looking for the few who had survived. The greatest shipwreck in their history simply slipped beneath the surface of memory, the way the ship herself had slipped beneath the waves. But a silence like that does not stay empty. It fills with stories. Some said no one had survived at all. Others insisted there had been not 8, but dozens. One tale, retold for decades, told of a pregnant woman named Anastasia Popova, who had thrown herself into the freezing November sea and somehow swum to shore. The historians who later studied the weather of that morning, the gale, the high waves, the cold, doubt that any such swim was possible. But that is exactly the point. Where the records were thin, the legends grew thick, and the thickest legends of all gathered around that missing 6 hours and around the question of what, if anything, the Armenia had been carrying in her hold. This is the legend that will not die. It says that on her last night, in those missing hours, the Armenia made a secret stop, that officers of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, came aboard with sealed crates, and that inside those crates was treasure, gold, some said, the valuables of the Crimean museums, or, in the most haunting version, masterpieces from one of Russia's great art collections, paintings by Bryullov, by Repin, by Levitin, that had been on display down the coast and were now being spirited out of the path of the German advance. Others swore the crates held not art, but secret state documents. If the story is true, then all of it, the gold, the canvases, the papers, is still down there now, in the dark, scattered across the seabed with the dead. And yet, we should be careful. A historian in Yalta named Alexei Spasenkov has spent years inside the archives, reading nearly 300 files on the Armenia, and he is unconvinced. He finds no record of any stop at Balaklava, where the secret loading is supposed to have happened. In that weather, he argues, no small boat could have come alongside a ship that size without being smashed to pieces. The captain who supposedly defied orders to sail by day, he points out, was instead given a medal, the Order of the Red Banner, which is not how a state treats a man who disobeyed. The truth, Spasenkov suggests, is harder to dramatize and sadder to accept. There may be no villain, no treasure, no cover-up, only an overloaded ship, an impossible position, and a daylight sea the enemy controlled. But even he admits this. Not every file is open. At least one document remains stamped top secret to this day. For 79 years, the Armenia lay lost. Then, in the spring of 2020, a search far out in the Black Sea, about 15 miles off the Crimean coast, found her. She rests in the dark, a kilometer and a half down, far deeper than the Titanic, where almost no light or life reaches. The thing that finally proved her name was small and human and unbearably poignant. From the wreck, they recovered her ship's bell, and across its face, still legible after 8 decades in the deep, was a single word: Armenia. So why do we know the Titanic and not the Armenia? Part of it is language, and part of it is the Iron Curtain that fell after the war, sealing this story behind a border and a different alphabet. And part of it is simply this: the Armenia died in a war so vast that her thousands of dead were a single line in a ledger of millions. But scale is not the same as meaning. Every one of those unnamed people was a life. A wounded soldier hoping to go home, a nurse who had chosen to stay with her patients, a child who had been promised the journey would end in safety. They deserve to be more than the deadliest shipwreck nobody remembers. And there is one more reason her story matters. The Armenia sank in the very first days of the siege of Sevastopol, a siege that would grind on for some 250 days, that would swallow the lives of soldiers and civilians by the tens of thousands, and that would end the following summer in the fall of the fortress city. She was the Overture, the first great human catastrophe of a battle that is itself half forgotten in the West. To understand what Sevastopol cost, you begin here, 4 minutes off Yalta on the 7th of November, 1941. 5,000, maybe 7, maybe more. We will likely never know the true number, because no one ever wrote the names down. What we know is this: a ship marked with the Red Cross of Mercy, a sea the enemy owned, 4 minutes, and 8 people left alive to remember a city's worth of the dead. The Armenia is found now. The bell has been seen. But the crates in her hold, the missing hours, the sealed file, those she keeps. A kilometer and a half down, in the cold and the dark, she is still holding her secrets, and perhaps she always will.